This video is going to be all about the frames. It's going to be a slightly longer video because the frames are pretty important and they take quite a while to make, but also we made a few mistakes that need explaining so that other people can avoid the mistakes we made. There are 10 frames that need to be built and added to the boat, and they're numbered from 1 to 10 starting at the bow. Some of them are assembled as a whole frame before being added, and some are assembled in 2 halves which are then added piece by piece, and that just depends on which part of the boat they're being added into. At some point in the build, the frames also have to have a bit of flat bar added to the inside edge, and that's put there to add some stiffness. The instructions suggest that you add that flat bar in as you build the frames before they're installed. We started by building frame 6, which goes in between the 2 main bulkheads as part of the engine bay. Only after building that as a whole frame did we realise that because of the engine bearers we couldn't install it as a whole frame, and so we found we had to chop it back apart. After frame 6 we went towards the back of the boat and did frames 8, 9 and 10. We added the flat bar to them first and were very cautious and only used very small tack welds to make the join between the flat bar and the frame pieces. Right, so this is the port side of frame number 9, and what we're doing is just putting like a flange on the inside. It's got to be offset more towards the front than the back, and then we'll assemble all the pieces. Actually, frames 8, 9 and 10 all go together in 2 pieces. So yeah, nearly there. Need a lot of clamps. So what we've got is frame number 8, and we're putting it down on the bottom plates, which we've already put these longitudinals in as per the instructions, but I think what we've done is just welded them a bit too securely, because they're not coming down, the ink markings and the cuts aren't exactly the same. So if we'd have left them welded less, then we'll be able to move them around more and it'll be easier. As it is, we're going to just have to grind out a couple of the tacks we've put in, and that'll allow us the sort of movement to put the longitudinals in these slots, and the whole thing should slide together nicely. We're there. So we're here at the back of the boat just fitting frame 8, and we've got just a little bit of a difference in the sort of shape of the boat from the bottom plates to the frame. The frame is the correct shape, and if you see it's touching on the outsides, but we've got a bit of a gap in the centre here. And so what we're going to do is just use some tools to help bring the centre of the bottom plates up. So we've attached this this piece of angle here we've made, and then we're just going to use this iron bar to just pull the plate up. Right, go on, Clay. Yeah, and then the gap closes. Ta-da! Just repeat that for everywhere there's a gap, and the whole thing fits nicely. Well, this is attempt 2 at the same problem. We couldn't quite get the very centre to come up enough, so we've got the same thing but slightly longer, so that we can fit the bottle jack to provide the pressure to bring the bottom plate up. So if you see, it's attached down here and at the other side at the centre line, and that allows when you push up on the bottle jack, that's actually pushing on this plate and lifting the bottom plates up. You'll see as we install those frames that we didn't have an exact match between the frames and the bottom plates. And that's due to that same problem that we've been having with those bottom plates, where the angle between the two bottom plates was too steep. We'll be talking more about those bottom plate problems in a later video, which will kind of be in time with when we figured it out and what we did with them. Once they were installed, we then re-measured them, looking back at the plans to make sure that they were the right shape once they were installed. As individual frames, they all match the dimensions perfectly. It's been quite quick work the last couple of days, and we've now got frames 9 and also frames 10 in place, so you can really start to see the shape of the whole boat come together. Then we've also got to put the transom on, which will go up here, and that'll be it for a couple of days. With the back end all measuring nicely, I felt very confident, so I set up to make all of the bow frames. So I started off by attaching all of the flat bar to each piece of each frame before then building all of the frames. We find with repetitive tasks like that, it's best to try and make it a bit more production line so that you don't have to move the tools around as much. If I was to attach the flat bar to each frame and then make each frame as I went, it would mean moving the tools more often. So when attaching the flat bar, this is when I made one of our first mistakes, and I decided at this point to do a bit more welding on each frame, as there would be parts that would be much easier to weld now, flat on a table, than there would be once they're installed in the boat. Another mistake we made was adding the coach roof parts to a couple of the frames at this stage. The coach roof actually gets added at a much later stage once the deck plating is on. The only clue about this in all of the plans and instructions is the absence of a tiny little butt weld symbol in the frame assembly plans. It wasn't really much of a problem for us, as we could just cut the tacks and take the parts off. With the frames all built, we then started installing them, starting towards the back of the bow and working our way forwards. So today's a big day because we're putting the rest of the frames onto the hull. We have them all ready built up to put in, and so we've got 6 frames to put in today. By the end of the day, it should mean it looks something like a boat. We're fitting these frames now at the bow. This is frame number 4, and we've got a bit of a gap down here to kind of bring together, so I've just welded on a little kind of bracket temporarily, and then using a G-clamp just to pull everything together. Can you see that? Also, we're going to push this plate down a bit, so we're going to use the pry bar. We've already used over here a bottle jack with a kind of bracket welded on to do a bit up there. That was where the majority of the pushing needed doing, and there's just a small gap to close here. Once we'd finished installing them all, we looked back at everything and it just didn't look or feel quite right. This was most noticeable on the half frames and the smaller frames, which didn't look quite right at the deck level. It may look like all the frames are in, but actually we've got to take them all down again because we've made a few mistakes. Only small ones, nothing too critical, but it does mean we have to take them off again and do a bit of rework on it. So that's today's fun. Having taken all the bow frames off again, we set to on working out what the problem was. We used the part with the most error in it to figure out what had gone wrong. We made up a floor jig which allowed us to better measure the parts, especially the half frames. So we're working on frame 2 here, and we've got it down on this kind of floor jig. A lot of the frames come in 2 halves, and this is the only way we could figure out to be able to measure properly from the plans. And then we also use this to clamp the bits down and tack them in place. What had happened was the combination of 2 errors. Because we'd done more welding on the bow frames when we added the flat bar to each piece, we'd caused a little bit of distortion in every piece. Because we then assembled the frames with those errors, it compounded the errors over the whole frame and meant that the angle of the joins was slightly wrong. So when people find out that we're building a steel boat, the first question they normally ask is, how's your welding? And I always end up explaining that actually it's not so much about the welding's relatively easy, it's about how metal reacts to being welded, so weld distortion. And in this particular case we've got a piece that's got some flat bar welded to it, and because of that the flat bar's under tension, causing the part to change shape slightly. And as you can see here, the part has moved, and so the two parts don't line up like they should. And knowing how to respond to that, I think, is the hard bit. Most of the frames could be easily fixed and it wasn't a problem, but a couple of the smaller frames had too much distortion. Luckily for us, Edgar from Bruce Roberts Europe kindly offered to cut us and ship us some new parts free of charge. The second time round, in the installation of the bow frames, and things went a lot more smoothly. All the frames lined up nicely. We did find later there were a few issues where we'd put flat bar in that interfered with some other parts. But that wasn't a problem, we just cut them out. Details like that we'll include in our improved instructions, which we'll publish at the end of our build. We learned a lot of valuable lessons in the building of the frames. The first is that you should really carefully read the plans, and if in doubt, ask questions, because it's easier to ask questions than it is to sort out the problem later. The second is to think through the installation of all the other parts that come after this before making any decisions. And the third was that we should have built a better measuring jig earlier on. The fourth is that less welding is better. Once all the other parts are on, any welding that you do won't have as much of an effect in terms of distortion as earlier on in the process. Thanks for watching, and if you'd like to help us out, it really helps if you give us a thumbs up. So that would be awesome. Cheers. Things we do for filming.